is concerned, and it is concerned because we are here in an undertaking of reset dialogue. Everything began from that, began from the same author, which is the first chapter of the first example of European Islam, which is the author who coined the word Euro-Islam. It's Bassam Tibi, which is a Syrian, very known in Germany because he's living there. And there is the one who started talking about this idea. Is a very special idiosyncratic author, but we, as Reset Doc, we published the first book we published about issues having to do with Islam and the world after 2009, after 9/11, after 2001, was exactly the book we translated also into Italian, a book we put together with several essays of the same Bassam Tibi, whose title is Euro-Islam. It's not the only one, but it's the first of the several authors, and a lot of Morocco is involved in the book of Mohammed Hashas, because not only because he's Moroccan and professor in Italy at the Louis University, but also because other authors are involved of the belonging to the Moroccan, European Moroccan tradition. At this point, it's beginning to be a tradition. And there is a lot of involvement of another important author of Morocco, from Morocco, which is Taha Abderrahmane. Has a lot to do with in your book. And there was a lot of hope that the presence of so many Muslim intellectuals inside the Muslim migration to Europe would have helped to create a situation where ideas of pluralism, of democracy, and the Europe in the years we are talking now about are the years where European constitutions could and European political life was less questionable than it is now, where so many populist and illiberal forces has grown up. But in the end, it was the idea shared also by Tariq Ramadan, another important author involved in this book, was thinking that the adaptation to the situation, to the constitutional situation of Europe would have helped Muslim thought to develop a pluralist and liberal attitude. Now, the issue is on our table. The situation has changed a lot, for the worse and for the better, and for the better and for the worse, and in Europe, and the question marks about the future and the capacity of the Euro-Islam to present a framework more favorable to democratic development is open. It's open, and it's open to your discussion, and we can start now with our discussion with Alibasic.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this opportunity. To be brief, I will just thank Mohammed and congratulate him for writing and on writing this excellent book, and I hope he will continue. By way of contributing to the development of this project further, let me raise a few points. Two of them concern the popularization of this concept and the idea of European Islam among rank and file Muslims, And the other 2 points concern European Islam as a lived reality. So, first of all, let's not forget about that the European Islam is actually about Muslims. So anybody who is interested in promoting this idea has eventually to go back to Muslims and convince them that this is, if you like, authentic Islam for the European context. That's the authentic Islamic message for Europe, not some historical form of Islam. Because, as you know, this issue of authenticity for many believers, Muslim or non-Muslim, is the key, is a selling point. Who is authentic and who is not. Now, 2 things that I think can contribute to this, in this process of convincing ordinary Muslims that European Islam is the right path to and the right thing to pursue. Obviously, European Islam consists of things cultural, but also things normative. And cultural segment or aspect, I think, is a little easier to accept for Muslims, because even in classical Islamic jurisprudence, they have this idea of urf and aada, and so culture and custom is already there. So, they are used to varieties in that regard. The normative part of it, they have more difficulty with, okay? And in that regard, I think reminding Muslims of the fact that early schools or the schools of Islamic jurisprudence were originally named after the place of their origin, not after their founders, is actually telling us something about the role of geography in interpretation of Islamic norms and normative system. So it's not idiosyncrasies of the founders. It had something to do with Medina, with Kufa, with Baghdad, that really, with Cairo, later on in case of Shafi'i. So the context played a role. It played a role not just in fiqh, but even in usul fiqh, It made no sense for Imam Malik, Allah yarhamhu, in Medina to go after individual reports in order to know what Prophet alayhi salam did or did not do, when he had a whole town, transmitting this tradition. In the same way, his fellow colleagues in Baghdad or Kufa cannot follow the same methodology. They had to go different ways, invent different ways of knowing prophetic tradition. Now, if this is so, can we then think of European Islam as basically European madhab? Okay? Many presuppositions that fuqaha have in their mind when they derive norms of Islamic jurisprudence actually are not there in Europe, or are very different in Europe. Think of security. Think of the ability to practice your faith. Think of, when they talk about riba, for instance. I'm not saying anything here, but just, when you go into the banking system of Europe and you see what banking interest is, the idea you have about it changes dramatically, because people think of riba, as usury, but then you find that actually that doesn't have to be the case. So, now, just to conclude on this one, the work I have seen done by lesser known, probably, Muslim authors like Faisal Mawlavi, like Abdul Majid Najjar, and similar people who are probably not as philosophical as, Bassam Tibi, Tariq Ramadan, and these other people, and who are probably not as radical in their propositions, but I think they are helping ordinary Muslims to accept the idea that the idea of European Islam is not some conspiracy against Islam and so on, but that is the authentic Islamic message for Europe. The other point I want to make is, in the same way, is the issue of religion and culture connection. In principle, people get it, but then when it comes to examples, I think we need to show them that a lot of what is being presented as religion is actually just a culture, and they shouldn't be having problems with changing that. You know, we are all somehow in this trap of validating hadith. Is hadith sahih or not sahih? And then if it's sahih, then it immediately, you have to follow. There are many junctions actually there at which you can disconnect your action from your judgment on a hadith. One of them is the following. A Muslim scholar told me that he went to India to give a lecture to Islamic scholars there on Maqasid. And the people who welcomed him at the airport told him, he landed like this, no tie, but just like jacket and so on. And they told him, sir, you cannot go like that into the lecture hall. Why? Because they are not going to listen to you. You are not authority for them if you dress like Westerners. You have to dress like Prophet. Okay, how did Prophet dress? They told him, kameez and so on and so forth. So he said, fine. They went to bazaar, they bought something, no ironing, nothing, just put it on, and he's now authority. So he talked to the muftis there, and it was all well accepted. And then eventually, in the course of the lecture, he asked them, is it true that you wouldn't accept me like as legitimate scholar if I came with the European, and this is fine because this is... They say yes. Why is that the case? Because we have a hadith saying that Prophet, wore this and this. Okay. He then asked them, okay, do you have any hadith how Abu Jahl dressed? He probably dressed the same. And the point became very clear to them about religion and culture, So, hadith is sahih, but still doesn't say much. It's describing the culture of the day, not religious duty. Now, that is one. Those 2 points on the issue of how to, if you like, disseminate or popularize this idea of European Islam among Muslims. On European Islam as a lived reality, I already spoke a bit about it. In case of many Bosnian Muslims, I'm not saying all, European Islam is a lived reality. Most Bosnian Muslims accepted freedom of religion. Actually, the whole European Convention on Human Rights as part of Sharia via international law. If you have Muslims subscribing to international agreements, then they think it's become, al-Muslimuna ala shurutihim. So it becomes part of what you have to respect. Most of them accept nowadays Sharia as a moral code. They accept secular state and so on and so forth. Well, for a while, we were considered weak Muslims, to be weak Muslims by other Muslims who, when they came, they think, well, we are not really, you need to be converted, okay, to the proper Islam. But lately, they stopped doing it. They are not converting us anymore, because they realize there might be some value in what we do. I remember very well an Islamist leader, I don't want to name him because he asked not to be named. He came to us. At that time, we didn't have government after elections and so on. But religious education, religious administration, things were just fine, no problem. He said, how come? You don't have ministers, you don't have this, and things are fine. We said, doesn't have anything to do with him. He paused and said, see, I like this, but don't tell anybody. I like this, but don't tell anybody. So he liked the thing that religious affairs had nothing to do with government. He's a big guy, by the way. He's not just a low-ranking Islamist. Now, we still have a problem. We discovered it now that when we accepted European Convention on Human Rights, when we accepted the European framework for freedom of religion, then we discovered actually that we have Christians in our country who are very suspicious of secular state. And I'm not projecting here anything, International Republican Institute did recently a survey of attitudes of local religious communities towards secular state and so on and so forth, and they found out that actually Muslims are most accepting of the secular state, and it is some other groups now who have reservations. So, in addition to that, as you know, many European countries, states, especially Eastern European countries, Greece, Bulgaria, and so on, Serbia, they have problems with letting Islamic communities there do their job autonomously and independently. So they have severe trouble. They have problems, simply behaving like letting these communities be independent. And my final thought, if I may, do I have 2 minutes? Yeah. I've been speaking for 11 minutes. Final thought, I don't think what is happening in Bosnia is in any ways unique. People keep asking us when they come, okay, we like this, but is this like unique? I don't think it's unique. In 1878, which is like, less than 140 years ago, Bosnian Muslims were very Ottoman Muslims. So we initially refused to live under Kafir rule. We refused the Austrian government, despite the fact that actually Caliph told us, it's fine. We said, mind your own business. We don't want to do it. We wanted to fight when we were defeated. We wanted to migrate and so on and so forth. After a while, didn't take us more than 25 years, we realized actually you can be Muslim in a Christian state which respects rule of law, to the extent that after 40 years, we fought in the First World War and we died for Austro-Hungarian emperor, believing we were actually engaging in jihad, as some of you may know. After that, we lived under Orthodox government and then aggressive atheistic government. We survived very bloody World War II. We survived a genocide, and we haven't lost our religious identity. So I don't think there is anything special about Bosnian Muslim experience. It's just a matter of time. Give other Muslim communities in Europe and America some time, and I tell you, they will most probably end up in the same place. Thank you very much for your attention, and congratulations again, Mohammed. Thank you.
And now Massimo Campanini.
Thank you. As the time is short and tyrant, I should like to limit myself to 5 very short points. The first and the last are about the title. The idea of European Islam is at the same time courageous and dangerous. It is courageous because it means a role, the position of a Muslim within a particular situation. Different situation of starting because Mohammed is a North African man, and from the other side of the Mediterranean, now today there is a Europe not so open to North Africa and other peoples. And so for this reason, to think about a European Islam is at the same time courageous but also dangerous, because from the other side of the Mediterranean often they shoot, and so this is dangerous in a sense. The second point is more serious, is about the issue of the European Islam. I put only the problem on the table. There is Islam, but now there is the dimension of the Islamicate world. Islam and Islamicate world are not the same. The idea of Islamicate world is of Marshall Hodgson in his famous book about the venture of Islam. And the difference between the Islamic world and the Islamicate world is the difference between an original civilizational world and another one that is transforming and developing. And so I should like to put to Mohammed exactly this question. Do you think that the dangerous idea of European Islam is more understandable under the light of the Islamicate world and not of an Islamic world, changing completely, in a sense, the situation intellectually, geopolitically, and of course, philosophically. The third point is not a point, is only a marginal observation about the four intellectuals Mohammed Hashas discusses in his book, that is Ubru, Bidar, and Tibi, Bassan Tibi, and Tarek Ramadan, quoted also by Giancarlo Bosetti. Sincerely, to be completely sincere, the thing of Ubru and Bidar is not so much known to me, and so, but the thought of Tibi and Ramadan, it is. And I put only another provocation. Bassan Tibi is a European Muslim. This is the problem. Because I am a Italian Catholic? No. Because I was baptized in Italy, but I am no more Catholic. And so only because I live in Italy, I cannot be said to be an Italian Catholic. And so we can say that Bassan Tibi is a European Muslim. I believe no, because I don't see how Islam in Bassan Tibi thought is again Islam. On the other side, there is, of course, Ramadan. Ramadan is a controversial thinker. Sometimes he is very keen, sometimes he is ambiguous in a sense. But in fact, Mohammed distinguishes between the early Ramadan and the late Ramadan, a more conservative and a more progressive Ramadan. But in any case, the discussion, the analysis, and why not the application of some of Ramadan solution is a challenging problem in today Europe for the today European Muslims. This time, really European Muslims. And again, in an Islamic world or in Islamicate world. Because there is the difference between the Dar al-Harb and Dar al-Islam on the one hand, and on the other hand, there is the problem of citizenship. Because there is no more the situation of a Zimma or the situation of Dar al-Harb and Dar al-Islam, but there is the problem of citizenship. To be a citizen within a contemporary European country. And this is another very important problem. The fourth and last point is about an expression used again by Mohammed, the hermeneutics of alterity. And he writes that hermeneutics of alterity is needed to connect the comprehensiveness of a world religion like Islam and the particular circumstances of its rooting in the alien environment of Europe or in general of the West. The hermeneutics of alterity is of course a very pregnant philosophical points, and we are connecting again to the issue of Islamicate world, because, for instance, one of the most discussed thinkers, Western thinkers in the Islamicate world is Heidegger. And so if we put ourselves in front of Heidegger and in front of the problem of hermeneutics, we are involving in enormous space of research, of thinking, of intellects, because hermeneutics involves the use of the Quran and the use of the holy texts in general. I believe that in this sense we must be cautious not to be too conservative and not to be too progressive in a sense, because if we are too conservative, probably we face a stop of the thinking, a stop of thinking. Like some ulema who say that the earth is flat because the Quran says that God flattened the earth. And this is an exaggeration of conservatism. From the other side, there is an excession of modernity. And always in the perspective of Quranic exegesis, there is the problem of the Tafsir Ilmi. The Tafsir Ilmi is a very provoking approaching to the Quran, too much modern in a sense. And so I believe that also from this point of view we must follow a middle way, a wasateya, because the middle way and the wasateya are always the best way to approach a problem. The fifth observation is not the last before, this is really the last. The fifth observation is about another word in the title of Mohammed book, when he writes about the perpetual modernity. I have some problems about the perpetual modernity, because in my idea nothing is perpetual. There is also democracy is not perpetual. Democracy was born and will die. Humanity is not perpetual. Humanity was born and will die. There is a tradition in the Middle Ages about religion, the horoscope of religion, that say that also religion are born and will die, and Islam too. Also Islam was born and will die. This is the idea of Abu Mashar al-Balkhi, one famous astrologer of the Middle Ages. And so I believe that the idea of a perpetual modernity is fine if we understand perpetual as an ongoing and self-transforming modernity. What I mean is that if we have an idea of modernity, if we have a model more or less realized in practice of modernity, this model must not be the last, never. There is nothing lasting forever. All things are born, all things will die. And so also modernity, like democracy and maybe also like humanity, because I don't know if within 1 century the humanity will be here. But anyway, I believe that perpetual modernity could be an argument of discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Massimo. Now, Joceline.
When I received and read the book of Mohammed, I was very happy. And for the reason that this is the work of a young Muslim scholar who is looking back at the thinking and debates over through four major figures that indeed would be defining European Islam, with all the caution that Professor Campanini just mentioned. And I was happy not because of the content of each of these thinkers, because this thinking for all of them is limited, and I would agree that this is not real Islamic thinking, but because Mohammed is opening up a new road, and I will come back to this at the end of my comments. To give you a genealogic approach, the idea of European Islam, it's presented like this is it. When I started centuries ago to work on Muslims and Islam in Europe, there was no debate at all about that. All of them were considered immigrants. And I remember the first time that in France, actually the idea of moving away from immigration and building the identity of a religious group came through are we a minority? And there was nothing in the dominant Muslim thinking that could help respond to this question. And I remember interacting at the time with UOEF. I'm not going to translate this into English. The Union of Islamic Organization in France that started to invite shuyukh from Lebanon to find responses to that. So this was the situation. And so we have seen how it moved. It went from migrants to Muslims in Europe to European Muslims. And it's not the same thing that the European Islam. So what happened is the rise of a way of thinking that was discussed and shared by different protagonists with different sets of interest. The first one came from the Muslims themselves, and I would say the Muslim elite coming from Muslim majority countries, and let's be very clear here, that had been educated and socialized in the Muslim Brotherhood vision. And so this was very interesting to see the move toward we have to take into account the pattern of minority here. And it created a new domain that would be called fiqh al-aqaliyat that was very dominant until the early 2000s, but clearly didn't create, I don't think we can create a new school. And fiqh al-aqaliyat didn't want to be a new school. It was an attempt to look into the different madhab to find a solution for the Muslims in Europe. And this has to be done with a progressive training of young people or education of young people who in their family, and I have lived with this family and I have shared bread with this family, the fathers at the table were telling them, you are not part of this society. So how do you do with that? With the references of your parents is, and especially with Algerian, with I have a kind of family bond, it was, you cannot become a French. My father, my uncle died to be not French. This was the situation in the post-colonial condition. So the new thinkers, and in this way I think Tarek Ramadan, not for the depth of his thinking, honestly, but for his psychological healing of the young people, telling them you can be Muslim and French, and you are not betraying neither. And I think this is important to maintain. And he was one of the first, instead of inviting a sheikh from Lebanon, he was one of the first in the first period of his career or trajectory to work on the grassroots with people, and that's where we met when I was doing this PhD again centuries ago. So this is also a moment of changes that will arrive to the idea there is still no consensus on European Islam, but it's in the political discourse. Then Bassam Tibi will come and put a special twist on it that will be very much criticized by people like Tarek Ramadan about an European Islam that is an Islam that has been assimilated to the European political and religious culture. And it will fit nicely with the parallel attempt by all states in Europe to nationalize Islam as well. This is also at the end of the 80s or mid-90s, the rise of what I call bureaucratic Muslim leaders, the one created by the different states. In France, in Germany, to a lesser extent in the UK for multiple reasons. But you see emerging leaders who have been anointed by the state of the different European countries and have been granted the legitimacy to talk about Islam. And this form of bureaucratic Islam is still there, with more or less success, but it's still there. It doesn't represent or cannot be a canopy for all forms of Islam, but that's why also some people will push back against this disciplinization or bureaucratization of Islam. And at the end, I would say that there is everything. If I have 2 minutes left?
2 minutes, yeah.
I think that we have to really look into the rise of a Muslim elite who is really trained in Islamic studies. And I don't think it exists yet. So an idea of European Islam will not be a wishful thinking from bureaucrats or leaders of Muslim organization. It has to come from a training that cannot be only under the pressure of political constraints. And in this sense, I would consider all this form of European thinking, as the book presents them, as what I call this governmentality. Most of the responses came from the necessity to show to European leaders that you can be Muslim and a good citizen. The only one that I think in this book is Tarek Ubru, who is trying to respond to the need of Muslims on the ground, that is looking at this maslaha of the community, not of the political interest of the prince. And this is very different, but it's isolated. You can have very good people in different places. If it doesn't become institutionalized, it doesn't go anywhere. And in this perspective, I think that the issue of European Islam, like we had the Indian subcontinent or of the Balkan, will not happen if there are no independent institute of higher education that do not respond to political pressure. And that's why also I think this idea of European Islam is being very challenged by transnational groups that are telling them Europe doesn't exist. You have to identify to the global abstract ummah, which is another political project. So I stop here.
Good, very clear. And thank you, Joceline. And Jonathan, you are not new to the issue of European Islam, because you are the author of 2 books, one of the emancipation of Europe's Muslims and also integrating Islam in France. Well, 2 works on the issue, which is not the same issue, but you are speaking of Europe's Muslims, which you are treating them as different things, not a unity. But in the end, the question coming from the experience of Bassam Tibi and of also the sad experience of Tariq Ramadan, which is, we have not to forget that he's under arrest because of sexual harassment and because of the Me Too series of things. But in the end, before that happened, the lesson we can draw from these 2 authors was that Muslim would have find an adaptation of their mind to the European situation in terms European conceived as constitutions, democratic constitutions. evidently not the Europe of Marine Le Pen and of Salvini, but the Europe of the European constitutions. Do you think that this hope has made some road?
Thank you. These are indeed the very questions, and I should say that the first time that I discovered Reset Dialogues on Civilizations was when it was running the website called Café Europa, which must have been, 15 or more years ago. And I know that these conversations were already taking place within a very hysterical environment. And I appreciated the efforts of Reset to calm the conversation. And I actually believe that Mohammed Hashas's book is perfectly within that legacy of calming the conversation and focusing it from what are, on the one hand, sometimes impossibly theoretical issues, and on the other, unnecessarily politicized issues that have very little to do with religion. And so I congratulate Mohammed really on what is a meticulously written book, a very carefully researched book. It is interdisciplinary, and what is really helpful is that it refuses the opposition that we are used to as a kind of received wisdom between Islam and the West, and helps us, I think, just like this conference intends to do, to think about the Mediterranean, especially more holistically, and less in terms of this artificial and bizarre north-south barrier that we have come to imagine as a result of the colonial experience. So I think that as a historical document, this is a very useful book because it profiles some of the key thinkers and especially some of the key positions that are possible in this debate. And one of the things that I find most stimulating about the work from the perspective of someone who studies organizations and institutions is the virtual absence of organizations and institutions from this reflection. Now, I think that what this reminds us, with this intense focus on the theoretical vision of coexistence, the theoretical underpinnings of compatibility, he reminds us of the groundwork that is necessary for any institutional effort to actually take hold, right? Because as Joceline was just saying, we have this danger that institutions are kind of projected based on desire and wishful thinking, and that if the institutions are not able to take root or are not indeed sinking their feet into something specific, there's no reason to think that the institutions will last, and no reason to think that they wouldn't simply be wiped away in a flood. So this book, I think, is going to be a vital document for future historians, because Mohammed Hashas is portraying processes of internal adjustment between majority and minority societies that will take place over generations and indeed over centuries. And I would like to differ with Professor Campanini here and say that I am hopeful and optimistic that we will be here for a couple centuries more in our current form. And therefore, this is a guide, I think, for how to read and understand these discussions by those who are most affected by them. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that it is just because something is normatively desirable, which is to say that these processes should be allowed to play out based on intellectual argument and the strength of their positions. It doesn't mean that we are going to have this conversation without undue interference. We are going to have exactly the kind of interference that Joceline was mentioning by those who pose as the guardians of something, right? And what are they posing as the guardians of? Well, something pure, something unadulterated, something that would refuse the inclusion of the adjective European next to the substantive of Islam. And so here I think we can think about some of the institutions and organizations that Mohammed Hashas purposefully skates over and excludes from his analysis, such as the European Council for Fatwa and Research. And he excludes it, I think, very logically, because it's not quite a European effort. Right, and he shows this by its composition and its membership. But just like the other Islamic hegemons that Joceline Cesari brings our attention to, we cannot simply wish them away. Right? We can't just wish they didn't exist, because the fact is that they are actors with resources who are deploying these resources daily on the ground. And so in my mind, the same goes for efforts that we might wish well, right? Like the Council, the European Council for Moroccan Ulama, or the Institute of Mohammed VI for training imams and morshidats for around the world. These are institutions with resources. And for me, one of the only good reasons for liberals to engage with the question of religious content, mostly I think that is not the purview of a liberal analyst, it's because of the demands upon the public, upon the general public, all of us, that these institutions make. Because those institutions are subjected to state regulation by the rest of us. And that is because of the role that religion has in our modern societies. When they ask for non-profit status, when they ask for tax exemption, for educational licenses or accreditation, for the right to bury or slaughter as they wish, the animal slaughter, this is something that meets directly not the internal discussion of Islam, but indeed the sort of, it must pass the judgment and inspection of the majority society. And so here I would say that it's simply very difficult for us to avoid what the French would call le culte, right? L'exercice du culte. And so I would ask of Mohammed Hashas to talk a bit more about this, about since the state does choose interlocutors, but we don't want it to be picking winners or losers within internal theological developments. What do we do in the meanwhile? What do we do knowing that the choices that states make are going to be shaping the very discussion that is taking place? And yet, how can we organize or help even a European Islam to flourish without choosing interlocutors? And how do we choose interlocutors if we're not going to base them on our preferences, but rather upon what they're doing on the ground? And so, given that liberal states are going to be most likely interacting with those institutions that are asking the most of the public, how do we insert these visions practically into the daily practice of religion, which is really the only area I think the state has any business even poking its nose in? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jonathan. This is a big issue, and I think that, we cannot avoid to spend some minutes in discussion and discussing it. Please come on with your, at the podium. I'm in debt with all of you of not having quoted, having quoted the work that Joceline has made. Also, a lot about the European Islam, about Muslim in Britain, Germany, France, beginning with the Et Musulman in France. There are a lot of work that Massimo has made on Tariq Ramadan and several books, and also Ahmet about Muslim in Europe did a lot. Come on.
Thank you.
We'll give the floor to Mohammed Hashas.
Okay. Thank you very much. I want to ask something to all the speakers. Some of the speakers, like Professor Cesari, already mentioned this point, and my question is about idea of European Islam or idea of European Islams, which is for many European states ask Islam to become something clericalized. I mean, to structure itself in the same way as European governments are used to deal with religious orders and religions. So the future of a European Islam will follow this European method, or will try, in your opinion, in order to maintain its identity as Islam, should try to find another way and not follow this, what is asked, for example, in the Italian case, which is what I know. The Italian case is asking Islam to find a unique representatives for Italian Islam in order to be able to dialogue it. Thank you.
Let's collect last questions. Please come on the podium. You two. 4, and then stop. And then you have 10 minutes at the end.
السلام عليكم. شكرا على مداخلتكم القيمة، وأهنئ الأستاذ حسحس بمولوده الجديد وأتمنى له كل التوفيق. إذن لم أقرأ الكتاب، ولكن انطلاقا من ملاحظات الأساتذة وكذلك من قراءتي للعنوان أتفق مع أستاذ كومبانيني حول أن العنوان يثير مستفز ويثير عدة تساؤلات. فقضية إسلام أوروبا بالنسبة لي يطرح سؤالين هامين. أولهما: هل هناك عدة إسلامات؟ وفي هذه الحالة ما هو القاسم المشترك والأرضية المشتركة بين هذه الإسلامات حتى يتسنى لنا الحديث عن الدين الإسلام؟ وهل إسلام أوروبا هو مذهب؟ ثانيا، مع بروز طبقة المسلمين في أوروبا، خاصة بعد توقف حركة الهجرة في الثمانينات التي جاءت بعد أزمة البترول، وبحيث أصبح للمهاجرين في أوروبا بطاقة تعريف وحقوق من بينها حقوق التمدرس، بات الإسلام والمهاجرون المسلمين يهددون الساحة الثقافية والسياسية لأوروبا، بل يهددون اللائكية ويهددون أيضا الجمهورية. فظهرت عدة نظريات إيديولوجية، مثلا لوغابيا وسيادة البيض et le grand remplacement de Renault، الاستبدال العظيم. فهنا هل فكرة إسلام أوروبا هي une alternative، يعني بديل للرد على هذه الأنواع من الإسلاموفوبيا السياسية مع la montée du nouveau libéralisme et اليمين المتطرف، ورد أيضا على الإسلاموفوبيا النخبة، l'islamophobe de plume، والتي تشير إلى la démission des intellectuels en Europe. Je vous remercie.
Thank you. The next.
Okay, good morning, sirs, and thank you, Mr. Mohammed, for this new book. So I hope to ask you about how did you deal with the Islam for Europe or Sharia for Europe movement in your book. Thank you so much. And if I want to get a book, how can?
Thank you so much for your interventions, and thank you for this opportunity, which is a golden opportunity for me to be here with you. I am Abdulaziz, a lawyer at the bar of Casablanca's lawyers, and also the General Secretary of the Youth Government of Morocco, also the General Secretary of the Moroccan Forum for Freedom of Belief and Thought. So this is a good occasion for us to put some good questions and to try to define the right Islam.
in your book, and congratulations, Mr. Sidi Mohammed, for your book, the European Islam, or the idea of European Islam, lead us to think that there is a European Islam, but another Islam which is not European, which means that there could be other Islam, African Islam, Moroccan Islam, Egyptian Islam, Tunisian one, and each country depends of his interests will call his Islam as an Islam. But is that the right Islam? This is a question that I need an answer. Every country is trying, as Montesquieu said, that the religion is the opium of people, which means that governments and systems, they can use sometimes religion as Islam or Judaism or Catholicism in order to serve their interests. But you know that Islam of the 17th century is not the Islam of nowadays, which means that we should ask the right question. What is the model, the right model of Islam? Which one of these kinds of Islam is the right Islam? Which one is the God's Islam? If we want to know Islam, we should go through books. We should know the right Islam from its sources, which is for us, for example, as a Muslim, the Quran and the Sunnah. And not only hear about Islam from this, for example, Tariq Ramadan or any other authors. They can talk about their Islam, the way they see Islam. But we need to go to the right sources to understand Islam, because all of this will lead to tolerance. We're talking about tolerance, which means we should understand each other. We should have a good and efficient, sufficient communication to understand other religions. And as Socrates said, know yourself by yourself. We should understand ourselves before understanding others, and we should open a rational communication to lead over or to go over a tolerance. I want to also take advantage of the opportunity to ask for your recommendations, as I talked with Mr. Bosetti and Jonathan and Joceline yesterday. If you have any recommendations that we can propose, for example, to the Moroccan government, and we can work on their adoption to maybe strengthen the tolerance in the Mediterranean societies. Here in Moroccan law, there are some articles that should be really modified, and I take also advantage of this opportunity to ask for your help in presenting some recommendations. For example, there is an article that incriminates the changing other religions, for example, especially Islam, which I think it's really abusive. It's abusive. Anybody has its own brain, has its conventions that can try and choose the right religion he wants. It's a question of freedom. So I believe always on the influence of rules on behaviors of people, which means when we constitutionalize an idea, a rule, this can lead over a behavior that we may be not asking for. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Now, if you don't have people on the panel, any urgent issue, we'll give the last minutes to Mohammed Hashas.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be on this table with distinguished professors in the field from whose works I have learned a lot earlier in struggling to the book. The book is originally my PhD, but it is also something beyond PhD. It has taken some 8-9 years. It does not deal with institutions, yes. It does not deal with political Islam and movements. It is a work on Islamic thought and how it navigates between the tradition, theology, and a little bit meta-politics or beyond politics. It is, since we are speaking about tolerance, and in the previous sessions of the conference, we scholars have tried to see what Muslims said or how they dealt with the other, and whether there was the concept of tolerance or not. And etc. This document is an intellectual testimony from Muslim perspective in Europe. So that's the aim that has been behind. The aim is to study what Muslims think of Europe and their Islamicity in Europe. In that sense, they navigate their epistemology in a modern context. So they belong to the Islamicate in Hodgson's perspective, but actually it's no longer Islamicate. They would not recognize themselves as thinking within the Islamicate, because the Islamicate of Hodgson was at the time of religious mindset, religious empire's mindset, and in confrontation with mostly the Christendom, Christianate. So these scholars cannot, I think, we cannot put them, because the epistemology of modernity within which they work is also not the same. But they try to find links. So this is a work on ethics, theology, and political philosophy. It works on 4 figures and who come from different perspectives, and there is most of them are intellectual Muslims from academic perspective, as some are intellectual public figures like Tariq Ramadan, and some are in the field like Tariq Obru. So he's a self-made theologian, is respected, I should say, in France, and then from a philosophical perspective, and that's the case of Abdel Nour Bidar, who is born French Muslim, who went through spiritual crisis himself, and then he tried to develop his own interpretation of Islam, and is influenced by 2 major figures, Ibn Arabi and Iqbal. So that's how he navigates Islamicity or being Muslim in the French Republican context. This work tries to also, and mostly tries to fill in a gap in the scholarship of Islam and Muslims in Europe. From the 80s and 90s so far, there is dominance of at least 3 major disciplines of the study of Muslims in Europe, which is sociological, anthropological, and political scientist or a security approach from political science perspective. And securitization is the word they borrow from Joceline. And there is no work so far that tries to understand why do these Muslims, who the sociologists and anthropologists tell us they cling to their Islamicity and they express it differently. But there is no theoretical work that tells us why they do so. And this work tries to do that and tries also to organize those thoughts. And there is a lot of material from sociologists and anthropologists. And this one uses that material to speak about this supposed abstract idea of European Islam. So it's not an assertion of European Islam, it's a study of these Muslim voices in the European context. In the book, I also distinguish between 2 major schools in the study of European Muslims. One that thinks that Muslims in Europe do think, and one school that thinks that no, they just act. There is no theology in process, there is no theology in the making, or there is no serious intellectual debate among Muslims, whether youth or by intellectuals or maybe religious leaders. Well, among religious leaders it's rare, but still there are, if we include the European Council for Fatwa and Research, it is an attempt from the external side, from mostly the Islamic or the Arab world, to think for European Muslims. But recently there are changes within the institution itself for European Muslims of Fatwa and Research, created in 1997. But anyway, the work excludes this, but the issues that the book raises are the issues that these works like Islamic movements or European Council of Islam debates, like the state, sovereignty, human rights, equality, liberty, and also environmental ethics. So this is a book of Muslim engagement, Muslim Islamic thought engagement with contemporary modern issues. It tries to solve the problems of the community, yes, and the state and its benefits and drawbacks, the issues that have been raised by different scholars and emphasized by Joceline, the choice of the bureaucrats who speak for Islam and Muslims, the external intervention of the sending countries, countries of origin, Turkey, Algeria, Morocco, etc., or the international movements, Muslim Brotherhood, or the jihadis. So these intellectual projects respond to these challenges. But what I do in the book is that I try to emphasize two things. There are two things that are mostly as concepts emphasized by these scholars: the question of ethics and the question of justice. I discuss the question of ethics based on the framework of Taha Abdurrahman. Among the contemporaries, I have found that his work is the most tries to present a more systematic project on what ethics could mean, leaving aside critique. And on the political side, that's where theology and the question of ethics, moral philosophy comes in my work, in my book. And then the last part of the book tries to engage, to get these concepts talk to Western philosophy or liberal philosophy, because these Muslims navigate or work or try to think in secular liberal context. And I've tried to use a scholar that is the American philosopher John Rawls as reference. So I have used these concepts and tried to use the concepts of these Muslim scholars and try to make them talk. So it is an intellectual exercise of Islamic thought. That's why my book could have also been entitled European Islamic Thought, because the idea is not to reach solutions on the political ground. While, of course, these are the issues that lead us to think and study certain issues because they are problematic. And to solve them, we need to raise the level of understanding them. That's why you go to the abstract, to concepts. So that's why the book tries to deal with these issues conceptually. Of course, I cannot say that much, but I will be concluding. Maybe I have answered differently. So this European Islam is not one. It's different. It's plural. It has no one speaker or one representative. It's the way we say the Arab world. You have the Moroccan version, the Algerian version, the Saudi version, and then you have the Asian version. But even in the Asian or Southeast Asian, you have different Indonesian, Malaysian, Pakistani. The European Islam then is navigating, and these institutions that Jonathan asked me, where is the place of institutions? Well, there is gradual work being done, and the sociologists, anthropologists have shown us that there are successful stories often don't make noise. It's the bad stories that are mostly in TV and make noise. But European Islam is a reality, and this thought tries to overcome or engage. So while the state institutions are taken for granted, but they are also not taken for granted as an absolute. There is a critique. That's why there is critique of modernity and Western modernity, and this is the homework of Muslims or Muslim scholars, and the Europeans or Muslims, let's say autochthonous, because they are also doing their work. The so-called second liberalism or political liberalism or John Rawls is kind of a rectification of the Millian version of classical liberalism, where the perception of the good is one based anyway, the autonomy of the individual. But so there is a critique. So there is an engagement with Europe. There is an embrace of Europe, but that's also there is a critique inside, and that's where I think posts for future more thought on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mohammed, for your book, your work. And this is the end of the conference, but not, as you know, the end of the school. So, as usual, for the closing remark, there is no more time to close. We have to close. But what we can say is that the work has been made very well. We are very happy. We intend to go to publish the proceedings of our conference, even more the proceedings to complete a volume on the issue of tolerance, ideas, history, institutions of tolerance, where even the concept of tolerance, I'm sure the book will have a premise about what does that mean, tolerance or toleration. I think that at the end of the conference, at the end of the school, you'll be able to understand what tolerance can mean, having been clarified that the meaning of this concept are very complex and several and different. You know, there is a famous book of Susan Mendes, The Four Concepts of Tolerance. We opened our work, Mohammed said, was quoting the 5 meaning of tolerance according to Walzer. I'm suggesting you to continue to develop. There are many, many different issues involved. The negative meaning of tolerance, to whom one could add the concept of modus vivendi, which is even more than negative, is living together not differently but indifferently, which is always something more than a war, you know, something more than the truce of an armistice, which is also a form of beginning of peace. Anyway, this issue has to be developed. If not other outcomes, this conference will help you to come out with many, many different meaning of tolerance. I'm suggesting also the Stanford philosophy, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy about toleration. They don't take into account your suggestion of distinguishing tolerance from toleration. And so I wish you a good job for the following days.